The green room backstage felt smaller than usual that Tuesday evening. 23 contestants were crammed into the space, but all eyes kept drifting to the elderly man sitting quietly in the corner. Harold Morrison was different from everyone else here, and not just because of his age. At 104 years old, he was easily the oldest person to ever audition for America's biggest talent show. While other contestants paced nervously or practiced their routines, Harold sat perfectly still in his navy blue blazer. 3 small military pins decorated his chest, each one telling a story of service from decades past. His weathered hands rested on his knees, occasionally trembling just slightly. The makeup artist had approached him earlier, asking if he needed anything special for the cameras. Harold had politely declined, saying his face had earned every line and wrinkle over the past century. He wasn't about to hide them now. "Can you believe they actually let him through?" whispered a young dancer to her friend. "I mean, what's he gonna do up there? Tell war stories?" The woman sitting next to the dancer shushed her quickly. There was something about the old man that commanded respect, even from strangers. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, straight-backed, despite his age. Or maybe it was the calm confidence in his eyes, like someone who had seen everything life could throw at him and survived it all. Harold's granddaughter, Jenny, had been the one to submit his audition video. She'd found him playing piano in his small apartment one afternoon, his fingers moving across the keys with surprising grace for someone his age. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, unlike anything she'd ever heard before. "Grandpa, what is that song?" she had asked, pulling out her phone to record. "Just something I wrote a long time ago," he'd replied, never stopping his playing. "Never showed it to anyone before." "Why not?" "It's incredible." Harold had paused then, his hands hovering over the keys. "Some songs are meant to stay private." "Sweet pea, this one carries too much weight." But Jenny wouldn't let it go. She'd secretly recorded more of his playing over the next few weeks, then edited the footage into a 3-minute audition video. She'd submitted it without telling him, along with a heartfelt letter explaining her grandfather's story. The show's producers had initially passed on the submission. A 104-year-old pianist didn't exactly fit their usual demographic. But Jenny wasn't giving up that easily. She'd posted the audition video on social media with the caption, "My 104-year-old grandpa has been hiding this beautiful song for 70 years. He deserves to share it with the world." The video had exploded overnight. Within 48 hours, it had been shared over 100,000 times. Comments poured in from people around the world, all begging the show to give Harold a chance. Veterans organizations picked up the story. Local news stations ran features. The show's social media accounts were flooded with demands to let Harold audition. Finally, the producers had called. They wanted him on the show. Now, sitting in that cramped green room, Harold still couldn't quite believe he was here. The other contestants were so young, so full of energy and ambition. What was an old man like him doing among these talented kids? A production assistant with a clipboard approached him. "Mr. Morrison, we need to do a quick pre-interview for the cameras. Just some background information for the audience." Harold nodded and followed her to a smaller room set up with professional lighting and cameras. The interviewer, a friendly woman in her 30s, sat across from him with a warm smile. "So, Harold, tell us about yourself. What made you decide to audition for the show?" Harold chuckled softly. "Well, to be honest, I didn't decide anything. My granddaughter Jenny made that choice for me. Girl's always been stubborn, just like her grandmother was. Tell us about the song you're planning to perform tonight." Harold's expression grew more serious. His hands, which had been resting calmly in his lap, began to move slightly as if playing an invisible piano. "It's called Letters Never Sent. I wrote it many years ago after I came back from the war." "Which war was that?" "World War II. I was a medic in the Pacific. Saw a lot of young men who never made it home to their families." His voice remained steady, but there was something deeper there, a weight that decades couldn't lift. The interviewer leaned forward gently. "Is that what inspired the song?" "Partly. When I got back, I couldn't sleep much. Kept thinking about All those boys wondering what they would have said to their mothers, their sweethearts, their children they never got to meet. So I started writing letters for them in my head. Then I started putting those letters to music. You never performed it before? Harold shook his head. Too personal, too heavy. I figured nobody needed to carry that burden but me. He paused, looking directly into the camera. But Jenny, she thinks differently. She says music is meant to be shared, especially music that means something. Back in the green room, the energy was building as showtime approached. Contestants were called, one by one, to prepare for their performances. Harold watched them go, each one nervous but excited, ready to chase their dreams on the biggest stage of their lives. A young singer sat down next to him while waiting for her turn. "Are you nervous, sir?" Harold considered the question. "Not nervous exactly. More like ... ready. I've been carrying this song for 70 years. Maybe it's time to let it go. What if you mess up? I mean, with all those cameras and people watching?" Harold smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep wisdom and experience. "Child, when you're 104 years old, you realize that messing up isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. The worst thing is living with regret for things you never tried." The production assistant appeared again. "Mr. Morrison? You're up in 5 minutes." Harold stood slowly, using his cane for support. His fellow contestants watched as he made his way toward the stage entrance. Some looked skeptical, others curious, but a few seemed to understand that they were witnessing something special. As Harold walked down the corridor toward the stage, he could hear the host introducing him to the audience. The sound of thousands of people filled the theater beyond the curtain. In a few moments he would walk out there and sit at that grand piano, just like he'd been dreaming about since he was a boy growing up in Tennessee. His fingers flexed slightly. At his sides, running through the familiar chord progressions in his mind, the melody of Letters Never Sent played softly in his head, as clear and powerful as the day he'd first composed it. Those notes had lived inside him for 7 decades, carrying the voices of friends who never came home, the hopes of families who never got their final goodbyes. Tonight, finally, he would set them free. The stage manager held up his hand, counting down silently. 3 fingers, 2 fingers, 1. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Harold Morrison." Harold took a deep breath, gripped his cane firmly, and stepped into the bright lights of the stage, ready to share his heart with the world. The bright stage lights felt warm on Harold's face as he settled into the interview chair across from the show's host. The audience had given him a standing ovation just for walking out, something that still amazed him. Behind the cameras, he could see Jenny in the front row, tears already forming in her eyes. "Harold, before you perform tonight, we'd love to hear more about your incredible life," the host said, leaning forward with genuine interest. "You were born in 1920, which means you've lived through some of the most important moments in American history." Harold nodded slowly, his hands resting on his cane. "I've seen a lot of changes, that's for sure. When I was born, most folks didn't even have electricity in their homes. Now, my granddaughter carries a computer in her pocket that's smarter than anything we had during the war." The audience chuckled, but Harold's expression grew more thoughtful. "I grew up on a small farm in Tennessee, way up in the mountains. My mama worked as a seamstress, and my daddy farmed tobacco when he could find work. We didn't have much money, but we had music." "Tell us about that," the host encouraged. "Well, my mama had this old upright piano that her daddy had traded for 2 pigs and a chicken back in 1910. Thing was missing half its keys and sounded like a dying cat most of the time." Harold smiled at the memory. "But to me, it was the most beautiful instrument in the world." The large screen behind him lit up with an old photograph showing a young Harold, maybe 8 years old, sitting at a worn piano. His small hands were positioned carefully on the keys, and his face showed the serious concentration of a child discovering something magical. "I taught myself to play by ear," Harold continued. "Mama would hum church songs while she worked, and I'd try to figure them out on the piano. Took me months to get Amazing Grace right, but when I finally did, I felt like I could conquer the world. The host smiled. And then came the war. Harold's expression shifted, becoming more serious. The playful light in his eyes dimmed slightly. December 7th, 1941, I was 21 years old, working at a lumber mill and playing piano at the local church on Sundays. That morning, we were all getting ready for service when someone came running in, shouting about Pearl Harbor. The screen now showed historical footage from that day, the black and white images stark and powerful. I didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was, Harold admitted. But I knew our country was in trouble, and young men like me had a duty to serve. You enlisted as a medic? Not by choice initially, Harold said with a dry laugh. I wanted to be a pilot, can you believe that? Thought it would be exciting, flying those big planes across the ocean. But when they found out I could barely see past 10 feet without my glasses, they laughed me right out of the recruitment office. He paused, his fingers unconsciously moving as if playing piano keys. The medic training was different. They taught us how to save lives instead of taking them, how to stop bleeding, how to carry wounded soldiers to safety, how to keep someone calm when they were scared and hurt and far from home. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Even the cameras seemed to move more quietly, as if afraid to disturb the moment. I shipped out to the Pacific in early 1943, first time I'd ever been on a boat, first time I'd seen the ocean. Most of the other boys were just as young and scared as I was, but we all tried to act tough. Harold's voice grew softer. We landed on an island whose name I can't even pronounce properly to this day. Hot, humid, full of bugs and danger. The screen displayed a map of the Pacific Theater, showing the island-hopping campaign that defined the war in that region. My job was to stay close to the front lines, ready to help whenever someone got hurt. Sounds simple, but nothing about war is simple. Harold was quiet for a moment, lost in memories from 8 decades ago. The host waited patiently, understanding that some stories need time to be told properly. I carried 2 things with me everywhere, Harold finally continued. My medical bag and a small harmonica. When things got quiet at night, I'd play softly for the other boys. Reminded us all of home, of the people we were fighting to get back to. Is that when you started writing music? Not writing, not yet. But I started hearing melodies in my head during the long, quiet hours. When you're sitting in a foxhole at 3 in the morning, listening for enemy movement, your mind goes to strange places. I'd think about the piano back home, imagine what songs I'd play when I got back. Harold's hands moved more noticeably now, his fingers finding chord progressions on his knees. But the hardest part wasn't the fighting or the fear. It was watching good young men die so far from home. Boys who had sweethearts waiting for them. Mothers who packed their lunches with love. Fathers who taught them how to throw a baseball. The host leaned forward. How did you cope with that? You don't cope, not really. You just carry it with you and try to make it mean something. Harold looked directly into the camera. I started imagining what those boys would want to say to their families if they could. What letters they would write if they had the chance. Letters they never got to send? Harold nodded. Exactly. I'd lie awake at night thinking about Tommy from Ohio who talked about his little sister every single day. Or Billy from California, who showed everyone pictures of his girlfriend at least 10 times a day. What would they say if they could speak one more time? The screen showed more wartime photographs, young soldiers smiling at cameras, writing letters home, sharing quiet moments between battles. Each face looked impossibly young, impossibly hopeful. When I finally made it home in 1945, I was different. Everyone who went through that came back different. But I was lucky, I came back at all. Harold's voice carried the weight of survivor's guilt that many veterans never fully shake. I used my GI benefits to study music therapy. Figured if music helped me through the dark times, maybe it could help other folks too. And that's when you wrote Letters Never Sent. Took me 3 years after I got home. I'd sit at my mama's old piano, she'd kept it tuned while I was gone. Bless her heart, and try to find the right melody for all those unspoken words. The song just poured out of me one night in 1948. I played it once, wrote it down, and then put it away. Why did you hide it for so long? Harold considered the question carefully. Some music is meant to entertain people, make them dance, or sing along, but this song, it carries something heavier. I wasn't sure the world needed that kind of sadness, that kind of weight. He looked out at the audience, then back at the host. But my granddaughter Jenny, she made me realize something important. She said that hiding pain doesn't make it go away. Sharing it, turning it into something beautiful, that's how healing happens. The host nodded respectfully. And now, after 70 years, you're ready to share it? Harold stood slowly, gripping his cane. His eyes were bright with determination, and something that looked like peace. Those boys deserve to have their stories told. Their families deserve to know they were remembered. And maybe, just maybe, this old song can help someone else who's carrying their own heavy load. As Harold walked toward the grand piano at center stage, the audience rose to their feet once again. But this time, the applause felt different. Deeper, more respectful. They weren't just clapping for an elderly performer anymore. They were honoring a man who had carried the voices of the fallen for 7 decades and was finally ready to set them free. The walk from the interview chair to the grand piano felt like the longest journey of Harold's life. Each step echoed softly in the massive theater, and he could feel the weight of thousands of eyes following his movement. The stage lights created a warm circle around the beautiful black piano, making it look like something from a dream. Harold paused for just a moment, taking in the sight before him. The piano was magnificent, a concert grand that probably cost more than his childhood home. Its surface gleamed under the lights, and he could see his reflection in the polished wood. For a brief second, he saw not the 104-year-old man he was now, but the young soldier who used to dream about playing on. Stages like this, the audience had grown completely silent. Even the judges, who usually whispered among themselves or checked their phones, sat perfectly still. There was something about this moment that commanded respect from everyone in the room. "Take your time, Harold," the host called out gently, from his position at the side of the stage. "We're all here for you." Harold nodded his thanks and approached the piano bench. Setting his cane carefully against the piano's leg, he lowered himself slowly onto the seat. The bench was the perfect height, and as his fingers found their way to the keys for the first time, he felt a jolt of electricity run through his hands. These weren't the chipped, yellowed keys of his mama's old upright piano. These keys were pristine, perfectly balanced, responsive to the slightest touch. He pressed middle C very gently, and the note rang out pure and clear, filling the entire theater with its perfect tone. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. In that note, he could hear everything: his mama humming while she worked, the sound of rain on the tin roof of their mountain cabin, the voices of young soldiers gathered around a campfire singing songs to keep their spirits up. 70 years, he whispered to himself, so quietly that only the closest microphones could pick it up. 70 years I've been waiting for this moment. He looked up at the audience, his eyes finding Jenny in the front row. She was crying already, her hands pressed to her mouth. Next to her sat his son Robert, Jenny's father, who had driven 3 hours to be here tonight. Robert looked nervous, worried about his elderly father performing in front of millions of people, but proud too. Harold turned his attention to the judges' table. 4 successful entertainers who had seen everything the industry had to offer. They looked skeptical but curious, probably wondering what an old man could possibly do that they hadn't seen before. He didn't blame them for their doubt. He'd probably think the same thing if he were in their position. "I want to tell you about this song before I play it," Harold said, his voice carrying clearly through the theater's sound system. The microphone, positioned near the piano, picked up every word perfectly. "It's called Letters Never Sent, and I wrote it for some friends of mine who never made it home from the war." A murmur rippled through the audience. Some people leaned forward in their seats, sensing that they were about to witness something special. Others looked confused, probably wondering why a talent show performance needed such a serious introduction. Harold's hands found their starting position on the keys. His fingers, despite their age and the slight tremor that came with it, felt surprisingly steady. Decades of muscle memory were taking over, his body remembering exactly how to sit, how to hold his wrists, how to curve his fingers for the best sound. "I never played this song for anyone before tonight," he continued, speaking directly to the camera now. "Kept it locked away because I thought it was too sad, too heavy for folks to carry. But my granddaughter Jenny, she helped me understand. Something important?" He glanced at Jenny again, who was now openly sobbing with pride and emotion. "She told me that music isn't meant to be hidden away like a secret. It's meant to be shared, especially when it carries love and memory and truth." Harold positioned, his hands over the opening chord. The theater fell so quiet that people could hear their own heartbeats. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath, afraid to make any noise that might disturb the moment. "This is for Tommy from Ohio, who talked about his little sister every day," Harold said softly. "For Billy from California, who showed everyone pictures of his girlfriend. For James from Mississippi, who could make anyone laugh even when things got scary. For all the boys who had words they never got to say." Harold's voice grew stronger, more determined. "And this is for everyone out there who's carrying something heavy, something they think they can't share. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is let other people help you carry the load." The first chord rang out into the silence, rich and full and heartbreaking. It wasn't a happy sound, but it wasn't completely sad either. It was the sound of remembering, of honoring, of love that transcends time and death. Harold's left hand began a simple but powerful bass line, steady like a heartbeat or the rhythm of soldiers marching. His right hand found the melody, tentative at first, like someone carefully opening a door that had been closed for decades. The music was unlike anything the audience had expected. It wasn't flashy or fast or designed to show off. Instead, it was deeply emotional, every note chosen with purpose and meaning. The melody spoke of longing and loss, but also of hope and connection. In the judges' section, all four panelists had stopped their usual fidgeting and note-taking. One judge, a tough music producer known for his harsh critiques, found himself blinking back unexpected tears. Another, a pop star who had seen thousands of performances, leaned forward with genuine interest, recognizing that she was witnessing something rare and authentic. The audience members weren't just listening to the music, they were feeling it. Parents thought about their own children, wondering what they would want to say if they had to leave unexpectedly. Veterans in the crowd felt old memories stirring, both painful and precious. Young people who had never experienced war found themselves understanding something about sacrifice and loss that they'd never grasped before. Harold's playing grew more confident as he settled into the piece. His fingers remembered every phrase, every dynamic change, every subtle rhythm that made the song breathe with life. This wasn't just a performance, it was a conversation with ghosts, a prayer set to music, a love letter to people who had been gone for 80 years. The melody began to build, telling a story without words. It spoke of young men writing letters home by candlelight, of final moments shared between friends, of families waiting by mailboxes for news that would never come. But it also spoke of the enduring power of memory, of love that doesn't die when the body does, of the responsibility the living have to honor the dead. As Harold played, something magical happened in that theater. The artificial divide between performer and audience dissolved. Everyone in the room became part of the same moment, sharing the same emotion, connected by the universal experience of love and loss that Harold's music made tangible. Harold himself seemed to grow younger as he played, his posture straightening, his movements becoming more fluid. The music was giving him energy instead of taking it away. For these few minutes, he wasn't a frail, 104-year-old man performing for strangers. He was a conduit for something larger than himself, a voice for those who could no longer speak. The song was just beginning, but already everyone in the theater knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just entertainment. It was art, it was history, it was healing made audible. And Harold Morrison, at 104 years old, was just getting started. As Harold's fingers continued dancing across the keys, something remarkable happened to his entire being. The slight tremor that had been noticeable in his hands earlier seemed to disappear completely. His shoulders, which had been slightly hunched from decades of age, straightened with newfound strength. It was as if the music itself was breathing life back into his tired body. The melody grew more complex now, Harold's left hand adding intricate bass patterns that spoke of his years of musical training. This wasn't the simple playing of an amateur who had picked up piano as a hobby. This was the work of someone who understood music at its deepest level, who could make the instrument sing with emotion that words could never capture. In the front row, Jenny watched her grandfather with amazement. She had heard him play many times over the years, usually simple songs at family gatherings or quiet melodies when he thought no one was listening, but this was different. This was Harold unleashing decades of suppressed musical passion, letting his true talent shine for the first time in his long life. The judges were completely captivated. The first judge, a woman known for her tough criticism of performers, had unconsciously leaned forward in her chair. Her usual poker face had melted away, replaced by genuine wonder. She had heard thousands of piano performances over her career. But there was something about Harold's playing that cut straight through all her professional defenses. The second judge, a famous singer himself, found his trained ear picking up techniques and musical phrases that impressed him deeply. Harold was incorporating elements of classical composition with jazz influences and folk melodies, creating something entirely unique. But more than the technical skill, it was the raw emotion pouring from every note that held his attention. The third judge, known for his flamboyant personality and quick jokes, sat unusually still. All his usual fidgeting and theatrical expressions had stopped. His eyes were fixed on Harold's hands, watching fingers that had lived through an entire century create beauty that seemed timeless. The fourth judge, the youngest of the group and typically the hardest to impress, felt something she had never experienced before during a performance. The music was reaching places in her heart that she didn't even know existed. She found herself thinking about her own grandfather, who had passed away when she was young, and wondering what stories he might have carried that he never shared. Harold's playing grew more confident and powerful with each passing moment. The opening section of Letters Never Sent was building to something bigger, something that would demand everything he had to give. His right hand began weaving a melody that sounded like voices calling across great distances, like messages being carried on the wind to people who could no longer hear them with earthly ears. The audience was experiencing something unprecedented. Cell phones that had been discreetly recording at the beginning of the performance were now forgotten in their owners' hands. People who had come expecting typical talent show entertainment found themselves transported to a different place entirely. The music was telling a story that everyone could understand. Even without words, a veteran sitting in the middle section felt tears streaming down his face as Harold's melody triggered memories of his own service. The music somehow captured feelings he had never been able to express to his family, emotions that had lived locked inside him for decades. Beside him, his wife reached over and took his hand, finally understanding something about her husband's experience that he had never been able to explain. An elderly woman in the balcony clutched her purse tighter as the music reminded her of letters she had received from her brother during the Korean War, letters that had stopped coming one day, leaving questions that were never answered. Harold's composition seemed to give voice to all the things her brother might have wanted to say in those final moments. Young people throughout the theater found themselves connecting with something they had only read about in history books. The music made the abstract concept of war real and personal, helping them understand the true cost of freedom in a way that no textbook ever could. Harold's technique was flawless, but that wasn't what made the performance extraordinary. It was the way he infused every single note with purpose and meaning. Each phrase of the melody seemed to represent a different aspect of the human experience during wartime. The fear, the camaraderie, the longing for home, the acceptance of duty, the love that persists even in the face of death. The composition was structured like a letter itself, beginning with tentative, careful phrases like someone choosing their words carefully. As Harold played, the musical letter grew more urgent, more emotional, as if the writer was running out of time and needed to say everything that mattered most. Behind the scenes, camera operators who had filmed thousands of performances found themselves struggling to maintain their professional detachment. The director in the control room, who usually focused on technical aspects like lighting and camera angles, was completely absorbed in Harold's performance. Even the sound engineers, who typically worried about audio levels and microphone placement, were listening with their hearts instead of their trained ears. Harold's body language told its own story as he played. His eyes were sometimes closed, lost in the memories that had inspired the composition. Other times, they were open and focused on the keys, watching his fingers bring to life melodies that had lived only in his mind for 7 decades. Occasionally, he would glance up at the audience, making brief eye contact with individual listeners. As if he were speaking directly to them, the music began to incorporate what sounded like military cadences, rhythms that any veteran would recognize immediately. But Harold wove these familiar patterns into something new, something that honored the military tradition while transcending it. The march rhythms became heartbeats. The call and response patterns became conversations between the living and the dead. As the piece progressed, Harold's playing revealed the depth of his musical education and natural talent. He incorporated techniques from classical masters, the improvisational spirit of jazz, and the storytelling tradition of folk music. But he made it all his own, creating something that belonged to no single musical genre but to the human experience. Itself, the theater's acoustics, designed for optimal sound, carried every nuance of Harold's playing to the farthest corners of the building. The grand piano's rich tones filled the space completely, creating an intimate connection between the performer and every single person in the audience. Regardless of where they sat, Harold's breath became part of the performance, audible through the microphones as he poured his entire being into the music. Sometimes he breathed with the rhythm of the piece, other times his breathing seemed to follow its own pattern, as if he were having a conversation with the melody itself. The piece was approaching its most challenging section, a passage that would require everything Harold had learned about music and life. His hands were moving with increasing speed and complexity, but never losing the emotional core that made every note meaningful. The technical demands of the composition were significant, but Harold met them with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment his entire life. As the music built toward what everyone sensed would be a powerful climax, the entire theater seemed to hold its breath. Harold Morrison, at 104 years old, was giving the performance of several lifetimes, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the lights dimmed and the curtain fell. Harold's fingers moved across the keys with increasing intensity as Letters Never Sent reached its most emotionally charged passage. The melody had grown from gentle remembrance into something far more powerful, a musical storm that seemed to capture all the chaos and heartbreak of war itself. His hands moved faster now, creating cascading runs of notes that sounded like rain falling on distant battlefields. The audience was completely mesmerized. Every person in that theater had become part of Harold's story, transported back in time to moments they had never lived but somehow understood perfectly. The music spoke a universal language that needed no translation. It was the sound of love and loss, of youth cut short, of dreams that would never be fulfilled. Then, without any warning, Harold's hands suddenly stopped moving. The silence that followed was so complete, so unexpected, that it felt like the entire world had paused. Harold's fingers hovered above the keys as if frozen in time. His breathing, which had been steady throughout the performance, became labored and audible through the microphones. The powerful melody that had been building to what everyone expected would be a magnificent climax simply ... ended. For a moment, the audience didn't know how to react. Had something gone wrong? Was Harold having a medical emergency? The judges sat forward in their chairs, concern written across their faces. Jenny started to rise from her seat in the front row, her mother's instinct telling her that something was happening to her. Grandfather, Harold's eyes were no longer focused on the piano keys. Instead, he seemed to be looking at something far away, something that existed only in his memory. His mouth moved silently, as if he were having a conversation with someone invisible. The stage lights caught the tears that had begun streaming down his weathered cheeks. The production staff backstage started moving toward the stage entrance, ready to intervene if Harold needed medical attention. The show's medic, always on standby, during tapings, picked up his equipment bag and took a step forward. But something in Harold's posture, in the way he held himself at the piano, suggested this wasn't a medical crisis. This was something deeper, something more profound. Harold single quotes, S breathing gradually slowed and deepened. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the sensitive microphones barely picked it up. But in the perfect silence of the theater, every word carried clearly to the back row. "Tommy," he whispered, and the name seemed to hang in the air like a prayer. The audience remained perfectly still, sensing that they were witnessing something sacred, something that demanded their complete respect and attention. Harold's hands still hovered over the keys, trembling slightly now, but not from age or nervousness. This was the trembling of deep emotion finally finding its way to the surface after decades of being buried. "Tommy Rodriguez from Cleveland, Ohio," Harold said, his voice growing slightly stronger. He pressed a single key, a low, resonant note that seemed to echo through the theater like a church bell. 19 years old, loved baseball and his little sister Rita, always said he was going to take her to see the Yankees play when he got home. Harold pressed another key, higher this time, and the note seemed to float above the first one like a spirit rising. "Billy Patterson from San Diego, California." His voice was steadier now, each word spoken with careful deliberation. 20 years old. Showed everyone pictures of his girlfriend Lucy at least 10 times a day. Carried her letters in his shirt pocket right over his heart. Another note joined the others, creating a simple but beautiful chord. The audience began to understand what was happening. Harold wasn't having a breakdown. He was conducting a memorial service, right there on the stage with his piano as the altar and his memory as the holy text. "James Washington from Jackson, Mississippi," Harold continued, adding another note to his growing musical monument. 18 years old. Could make anybody laugh, even when the food was terrible and the rain wouldn't stop. Used to do impressions of our commanding officer that had us all in stitches. The judges were no longer watching as entertainment industry professionals evaluating a performance. They were witnesses to something much more important, a man honoring his fallen friends in the most personal way possible. The tough music producer who rarely showed emotion found himself openly weeping. The pop star who had performed for millions was humbled by this display of authentic human feeling. Frank Murphy from Boston, Massachusetts. Harold's voice carried clearly now to every corner of the theater. Another note joined the memorial chord, each one representing a life cut short, a story left unfinished. 21 years old. Wanted to be a teacher like his father. Always reading books and trying to explain things to the rest of us. In the audience, people were crying freely now. Veterans recognized the ritual that Harold was performing, the sacred duty of the living to remember the dead, to speak their names and keep their stories alive. Family members of fallen soldiers from more recent conflicts felt their own grief acknowledged and honored by Harold's tribute. Robert Chun from San Francisco, California. The musical memorial continued to grow, each name adding another layer of meaning to the simple but powerful harmony Harold was creating. 19 years old. His parents owned a restaurant in Chinatown. He promised to bring us all there for dinner when we got back home. Harold's granddaughter Jenny was sobbing quietly in the front row, finally understanding the true weight her grandfather had been carrying all these years. She had known that the war had affected him, but she had never realized that he carried the names and stories of so many lost friends in his heart every single day. David O'Sullivan from Chicago, Illinois. Harold's voice was strong now, filled with purpose and love. 20 years old, red hair and freckles, could fix anything with an engine. Always said he was going to open his own garage and marry his high school sweetheart. The notes Harold was playing weren't random. They were creating a harmony that supported and honored each name he spoke. It was improvised but perfect, each addition to the musical memorial fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that only Harold could see. Antonio Ricci from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The list continued, each name spoken with the same careful reverence, each one accompanied by another note that added to the growing musical tribute. 22 years old, oldest in our unit, had a baby boy he'd never met waiting at home. Carried a picture of his wife holding the baby everywhere he went. Behind the cameras, hardened production crew members found themselves moved to tears. Camera operators who had filmed everything from comedy shows to drama series had never experienced anything like this during a live taping. The director in the control room had stopped giving technical instructions, realizing that the most important thing was simply to let Harold's tribute continue uninterrupted. Charles Williams from Atlanta, Georgia. Harold's voice never wavered, never rushed. Each name deserved its moment, its note, its place in this musical memorial. 19 years old. Played guitar and sang country songs around the campfire. Had the most beautiful voice you ever heard. The theater had become a sacred space, transformed by Harold's tribute from an entertainment venue into something resembling a cathedral. The names of the fallen hung in the air like prayers, each one a reminder of the true cost of freedom, of the young lives sacrificed so that others could live in peace. As Harold continued his memorial, adding name after name to his musical monument. Everyone in that theater understood they were witnessing something that would stay with them forever. This wasn't just a performance anymore, it was a lesson in love. In memory, in the sacred duty, we all have to honor those who gave everything for others. Harold's voice grew quiet again as he spoke the final name on his list. Michael Thompson from Denver, Colorado. 19 years old? Wanted to be a doctor like his grandfather? Always patching us up when we got hurt, even though that was supposed to be my job. He pressed one last note, completing the memorial chord that had grown throughout his tribute. The theater remained in complete silence for what felt like an eternity. Harold sat motionless at the piano, his hands still hovering over the keys, tears continuing to flow down his cheeks. The weight of 70 years seemed to lift from his shoulders as he finished honoring his friends. He had finally done what he'd been carrying in his heart for decades. He had spoken their names, told their stories, and made sure they were remembered. Harold reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an old, worn handkerchief. His hands shook slightly as he wiped his eyes, but it was a different kind of trembling now. This wasn't the tremor of age or nervousness. This was the release that comes after carrying a burden for far too long. Jenny watched her grandfather from the front row, her own tears flowing freely. She had never seen him like this before, so vulnerable, so open, so completely human. All her life, he had been the strong one, the rock of their family. But tonight, she was seeing the man behind the grandfather, the young soldier who had survived when so many others hadn't. Harold took a deep breath and looked up at the audience for the first time since he'd begun his memorial. The sea of faces looking back at him was filled with tears, but also with something else, understanding, respect, and love. These strangers had shared something sacred with him, and their faces showed that they understood the gift he had just given them. Those boys, Harold said softly, his voice carrying clearly through the microphones, they never got to come home. Never got to hug their mothers one more time, never got to marry their sweethearts, never got to meet their children. He placed his hands gently on the piano keys. But they're not really gone. They live on in the memories of those who loved them, in the stories we tell about them, and in the music that carries their spirits. Harold's posture began to straighten again. The act of honoring his fallen friends seemed to have given him new strength, new purpose. His fingers found their place on the keys, and he began to play again, but the music was different now. Where? Before it had been full of pain and loss, now it carried something else. Hope, celebration, and the joy of remembering love rather than just mourning death. The melody that emerged from the piano was still letters never sent, but it had transformed into something beautiful and uplifting. Harold's playing became more confident, more powerful than it had been even before his memorial tribute. It was as if speaking the names of his friends had freed him to truly honor them through his music. His left hand created a steady, marching rhythm, but this wasn't the heavy march of soldiers going to war. This was the proud, celebratory march of heroes coming home. His right hand wove a melody that soared above the marching bass, telling a story of reunion, of peace, of young men finally getting the welcome home they had never received. The audience felt the transformation immediately. Where moments before they had been witnessing profound grief, now they were experiencing something that felt like triumph. Harold wasn't just mourning his friends anymore, he was celebrating their lives, their courage, their brotherhood. The music spoke of eternal bonds that not even death could break. Harold's technique reached new heights as he played this final section. His fingers moved across the keys with the precision of a master craftsman and the passion of someone who had waited his entire life for this moment. The composition incorporated elements that sounded like church hymns, military anthems, and lullabies, all woven together into something completely unique. The judges were witnessing the performance of a lifetime. The first judge, who had critiqued thousands of acts over her career, knew she was seeing something that would never be repeated. This wasn't just entertainment. This was art in its purest form, music that came from the deepest places of the human heart. The second judge, himself an accomplished musician, was amazed by Harold's technical skill. Despite his age, despite the emotional weight of what he was carrying, Harold was playing with the precision and passion of someone a quarter his age. But more than the technical skill, it was the spiritual power of the performance that left him speechless. Harold began to hum along with his playing, his voice adding another layer to the musical tapestry he was creating. His humming wasn't perfect. His voice was aged and sometimes cracked with emotion, but it was authentic and beautiful in a way that no trained singer could match. He was sharing not just his musical skill, but his very soul with the audience. The melody grew more complex and joyful with each passing moment. Harold incorporated quotes from Amazing Grace, When the Saints Go Marching In, and other hymns that spoke of hope and redemption. But he made them his own, weaving them into his composition in ways that felt natural and meaningful rather than forced. As Harold played, his whole body became part of the performance. His shoulders moved with the rhythm, his head nodded with the beat, and his face showed the pure joy of making music after decades of keeping it locked inside. This was Harold Morrison, as he was meant to be, not just a survivor carrying the weight of loss, but a musician celebrating the gift of life and memory. The transformation in the theater was remarkable. People who had been crying just minutes before were now smiling through their tears. The music had taken them on a journey from grief to acceptance to celebration, and Harold had been their guide every step of the way. Harold's playing reached a crescendo that filled every corner of the massive theater. The grand piano's powerful voice carried his message of love and remembrance to every single person in the audience. The melodies soared higher and higher, like spirits rising to heaven, like prayers being answered, like love conquering death itself. Then, as the piece approached its conclusion, Harold began to sing. His voice was old and weathered, but it carried the wisdom and love of a century of living. The words he sang were simple but profound. Come home, you're not forgotten. Come home, you're loved forever. In every song, in every story, in every heart that remembers, you live on. The audience began to hum along, somehow knowing the melody even though they had never heard it before. The entire theater became a choir, thousands of voices joining Harold in his tribute to the fallen. Veterans stood up in their seats, some saluting, others simply standing in respect. Family members of those lost in more recent conflicts felt their own loved ones being honored in Harold's song. Harold's playing grew softer now, bringing the piece toward its gentle conclusion. The marching rhythms faded into something that sounded like a lullaby, like a mother singing her child to sleep, like peace finally coming after a long, difficult journey. As the final notes of Letters Never Sent filled the theater, Harold lifted his hands from the keys and placed them in his lap. He looked out at the audience one more time, his face showing not grief but gratitude. He had finally shared his greatest treasure, not just his music, but his love for friends who had been gone for 8 decades. The silence that followed was different from the silence during his memorial. This silence was full of awe, respect, and the kind of deep emotion that leaves people unable to speak. Harold had taken everyone in that theater on a journey through the deepest valleys of human experience and brought them out into the light on the other side. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Harold sat quietly at the piano bench, his hands folded in his lap, looking out at the thousands of faces staring back at him. Every person in that theater seemed frozen in time, still processing what they had just experienced. This wasn't just a performance they had witnessed, it was something far more profound, something that had changed them in ways they were only beginning to understand. Then, from somewhere in the middle section, a single person began to clap. The applause started slowly, just one pair of hands creating a rhythm in the vast silence. But within seconds, that single clap became 2, then 10, then hundreds. The sound grew like thunder rolling across the theater as every person in the audience rose to their feet. This wasn't ordinary applause. This was something deeper, more meaningful. People weren't just clapping for a good performance. They were expressing gratitude for being allowed to witness something sacred. Many continued to wipe tears from their faces as they applauded. Their emotions too complex for simple words to express, the standing ovation went on and on. Minutes passed and still the audience kept clapping, kept standing, kept showing their respect for Harold and the friends he had honored. Veterans throughout the theater saluted, their faces showing a mixture of pride and understanding that only those who had served could fully comprehend. Harold slowly rose from the piano bench, using his cane for support. The simple act of standing seemed to take great effort, as if the performance had drained every ounce of energy from his 104-year-old body. But his face showed no exhaustion, only peace, relief, and a kind of joy that comes from finally completing something that has waited decades to be finished. The judges were the first to compose themselves enough to speak. The first judge, a woman known throughout the industry for her tough criticism and rarely given praise, was openly crying as she reached for her microphone. Her voice shook as she tried to find words adequate for what she had just witnessed. "Harold," she began, then stopped, overcome by emotion. She took a deep breath and tried again. "In 30 years of judging performances, I have never... I can't even ... She paused again, looking around at her fellow judges for help, but they were all just as speechless. "What you just shared with us," she finally managed, "that wasn't just music. That was your heart, your soul, your entire life poured into one incredible moment. I feel honored just to have been here to witness it." The second judge, himself a successful recording artist, leaned forward toward his microphone. His usual, confident demeanor was gone, replaced by the humility of someone who had just learned something important about the true power of music. "Harold, I've performed in front of millions of people. I've had #1 hits. I've won awards," he said, quietly. "But what you just did up there, that's what music is really supposed to be about. You didn't just play a song, you opened a door to your soul and invited all of us to step inside. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do on any stage." The third judge was struggling to maintain his composure. Known for his quick wit and entertaining comments, he found himself without jokes or clever observations. Instead, he spoke from a place of genuine emotion that his fans had rarely seen. "My grandfather served in Korea," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He never talked about it, never told us what happened over there. After he died, we found a box of letters in his closet, letters he'd written but never sent. Your song, Harold, it felt like those letters finally found their way home." The fourth judge, the youngest of the group, was crying too hard to speak at first. When she finally found her voice, it was filled with wonder and respect. "I'm 28 years old," she said. "I thought I knew what courage looked like, what talent sounded like, what art could accomplish. But you just taught me that I didn't know anything. What you did tonight will stay with me for the rest of my life." As the judges finished their comments, the audience applause began again, even louder than before. But Harold seemed almost unaware of the acclaim he was receiving. His eyes had found Jenny in the front row, and the look that passed between grandfather and granddaughter said everything that words could not. Jenny was sobbing with pride and love, her hands pressed to her heart. She had always known her grandfather was special. But tonight she had seen him as the rest of the world would now know him, not just as a sweet old man, but as an artist, a historian, a keeper of sacred memories. Harold began his slow walk toward the front of the stage, where the host was waiting with his own tears flowing freely. The host, who had interviewed thousands of performers over his career, seemed as moved as anyone in the theater. "Harold," the host said, placing a gentle hand on the old man's shoulder, "I don't think any of us will ever be the same after what you just shared with us. How do you feel right now?" Harold thought for a moment before answering, his voice soft but clear. "I feel lighter," he said simply. "I've been carrying those boys with me for 70 years, and I was afraid that if I let them go, they'd be forgotten. But now I understand, sharing their memory doesn't mean letting them go. It means making sure they live on in other people's hearts too." But behind the scenes, the show's producers were already fielding calls from news networks, music labels, and documentary filmmakers. Harold's performance was going to be much more than just a viral video. It was already being called the most powerful moment in television history, but the real impact of Harold's performance couldn't be measured in views, or shares, or news coverage. It was happening right there in that theater, in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed it. Veterans were calling their families, finally ready to share stories they had kept locked inside for decades. Young people were looking up their local VFW posts, wanting to volunteer and hear more stories from those who had served. Music teachers were already planning lessons about the healing power of art. As Harold made his way backstage, supported by his cane and the show's staff, the audience continued their standing ovation. They weren't ready to let this moment end. Weren't ready to return to the ordinary world outside the theater. The video of Harold's performance would indeed go viral within hours of the show's broadcast. It would be shared millions of times across social media, with comments from people around the world sharing their own stories of loss, memory, and healing. Music schools would request copies of Letters Never Sent to study and perform. Veterans organizations would use Harold's example to encourage others to share their stories through art and music. A major recording studio would offer Harold a contract to record a full album, making him the oldest recording artist in history. But more importantly, his performance would inspire the creation of music therapy programs at VA hospitals across the country, helping other veterans find their own voices and their own paths to healing. Harold Morrison had lived 104 years, but on this night, he had given the performance of several lifetimes. He had shown the world that it's never too late to share your truth, never too late to honor those you love, and never too late to find the courage to be completely, authentically yourself. As the theater lights finally dimmed and the audience slowly began to file out, many lingered, reluctant to leave the sacred space that Harold's music had created. They had come expecting entertainment, but they were leaving with something far more valuable, a deeper understanding of love, loss, memory, and the incredible power of one person's courage to heal not just themselves, but everyone around them.